Familiar Strangers by Ray Suarez, read to you by Mrs. Weir. Now, this is nonfiction memoir, and as we read, we always want to keep in mind that that means this is someone's true story. They're bringing to the world their perspective, but they're still characters. In this story, they're still people with specific motivations, wants, or desires, and this is just a minor snippet of their life. And we want to understand what happens with their wants or desires when they don't get those fulfilled or someone throws up an obstacle. That's a complication in the story. It often leads to what happens next, and we want to follow that through line to how it ends. So we're going to read through, and I'll stop and give you some of my thoughts. We were among the first Americans. Why are we still strangers? The people you call Latinos, Hispanics, Spanish, wetbacks, which is actually an insult, and illegals, drew their first breaths when an infant was yanked, wet and screaming, from his mother's womb 9 months after Christopher Columbus and his hungry men alighted from their ships and walked ashore on the out islands of the hemisphere. 500 years later, we bust your tables, watch your kids after school, pick your strawberries, lay your sod, entertain you at Disney World, and frighten you on darkened streets. Weak of mind and strong of back, we populate your dreams of fabulous sex and immigrant invasion. We fill your jails and fight your wars. We live here for years and never learn your language, so you've got to pass official English and English-only laws. We veer between reckless bravado and donkey-like deference. Deference is like exaggerated respect. Our men can't hold their liquor, but they can carry a tune. They beat their wives and anyone who dares insult them. Their wives turn to lard after a couple of babies and remain completely compliant as they take care of yours. You know us so well, it seems. Why are we still strangers? So some of this, by the way, is oversimplification, or some of this I just want to point out is also possibly stereotyping, so watch out for that. That endless wrestling match between black and white, a struggle over everything, real and symbolic, needed fresh blood. They enter from stage south, and so you leave a Miami drugstore angry and resentful when a countergirl doesn't understand a perfectly simple question. Elderly homeowners who can't afford to move complain about noise and cooking smells, and Catholic churches become stages for the social drama playing itself out on the streets. Writers like Linda Chavez say Hispanic Americans follow the same generational trajectory as Italians, Irish, and Poles. Others, particularly in civil rights organizations like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, and the National Council of La Raza, say something different is happening. Having the old country 2 hours away by jet instead of across an ocean means these new Americans don't have to slam the door in their place of origin as other immigrants have. In the popular mind, the arrival of Spanish-speaking immigrants is closely associated with neighborhood decay. Reality is more subtle. Neighborhoods sag in some places, spruce up in others. Despite wildly different outcomes, a kind of reductionism is at work. A tendency to regard arrivals of Dominicans in Upper Manhattan, Mexicans in Chicago, Central Americans in Los Angeles as undifferentiated a meta-event. Meta-event is like a large-scale happening. Reductionism is just oversimplifying things. It's a version of stereotyping in some ways. They move too many people, or it's related to stereotyping. Let me stop that. They move too many people into two small houses. Their gang's emblems will start showing up in spray paint on garages. There'll be trouble at the school. You won't be able to talk to your neighbors. They may smile amicably, but they won't understand a word you say. It's all true. It's all false. A new generation of nativist critics bring their hands over millions of unassimilated residents, forming a fifth column. And there's an explanation of this idea of the fifth column down here. It's a term used to refer to a group of disloyal citizens, people who don't really fit in or fully treated as though they live this country. So unassimilated residents forming a fifth column and bringing Quebec to our door. They want old-style total immersion, that is, throwing immigrants into the deep end of the American pool. Their opponents, I'll call them ethnicists, want it both ways. So an ethnicist is in favor of multicultural and ethnic diversity. So these are people who are like, hey, it's great that our country is becoming more diverse and more like the American dream. Ethicists argue for continuing foreign language government services, yet when Latino acquisition of English is criticized as too slow, they insisted these immigrants are learning English as quickly as other Americans did. That's nuestra raza. And nuestra raza means like Spanish for our race. Able to learn the English language quickly and not learning English at the same time. Latinos are settling in urban enclaves. Enclaves are just neighborhoods that are just like they're distinct by their race, their racial makeup or their ethnic makeup. It's pretty common in some areas, but not in others. Okay. But it remains an open question whether they are bound to the ghetto the same way Black families of similar income have been. In their level of education, earnings, and consumption patterns, they resemble their gentrifying neighbors more than their Hispanic working class hermanos. Gentrifying is like renewing, not just renewing a new neighborhood, but kind of like pushing out the people who live there in exchange for moving in middle and upper class people. I'm an urbanite, says Jerry, a 33-year-old Mexican, his own term. His father's Mexican, his mother's Puerto Rican, who owns a home in Chicago's Logan-Square neighborhood. A high-income, skilled tradesman whose wife also works outside the home, Jerry acknowledges he's had to pick up places to live. But I feel it's important for the majority of low-income Hispanic kids in Logan Square to have someone as an example, to show that people like them can live comfortably, own a nice home. It's important for kids to see me going to work in a shirt and tie rather than heading to a construction site with a lunch bucket. Jerry's a rough Hispanic equivalent of the race man Black intellectuals talked about back in the 1950s and 60s. He speaks Spanish at home, watches Spanish television, though not exclusively, and has learned to play the cuatro, a small 16-string guitar, as central to Puerto Rican traditional music as the banjo is to bluegrass. Yet Jerry admits he has more in common with his white neighbors of European origin than with his Hispanic neighbors. Patricia, born and raised in Ecuador, is in her 40s and until recently was an executive director of the citywide agency serving Hispanics. She and her husband bought a 3-flat in 1986 and used its rapid appreciation to buy other investment properties. Patricia has left Logan Square for a new home in Wilmette. I'm representative of a group of friends who moved here as young marrieds, childless couples. At the time, it seemed we would stabilize the neighborhood, but then our concerns about education and safety started to take over when we had kids. And this close-knit group of people who live nearby is slowly eroding, and I didn't feel like I had any reason to stay around here anyway. Gustavo, also in his 40s, is a senior department manager in the Chicago city government. By law, he must reside in Chicago. He concludes that there is no way he would be living in Logan Square in 5 or 10 years. It would be more likely, he says, to find him living in Colombia, where he grew up. This is not a neighborhood I consider appropriate for my daughter, Veronica. Yet Gustavo finds much to like about Logan Square. He believes the neighborhood has become a magnet for upper-income Latinos, which has contributed to a sense of comfort. No one wants to feel isolated in a neighborhood, living in a neighborhood. Middle-class Hispanics are inevitably class straddlers, especially when they're homeowners. They perceive their property value to be tied to the future of Anglo investment in the area. They are thus economically tethered to whites while they maintain strong emotional bonds to Hispanics. When the interests of one group conflict with those of the other, must those straddlers make a choice? So they're kind of like sitting across a fence, and they have their feet on either side. And that's what they're talking about, like a little bit of both. With a strong desire to teach their children Spanish, to live in an area where Spanish is still an important language of commerce, to live near family and in the city, these Logan Square neighbors demonstrate an attitude toward assimilation far different from the one that opened the country. To assimilate, by the way, just the important thing here, is to behave like the people that you're around. So you have to kind of act like them. So, at the other end of the social and economic continuum, yet living nearby, are Latinos, boys in particular, who are convinced that America will never provide for them. The world of American Latinos, brought to you courtesy of your local late news, is populated by tragic gang members who believe in little except their need to enforce their code on their block. They live among shuttered factories and empty warehouses. Schools become irrelevant before they reach their teens. America's going to have to see and reach these young men. America says for juvenile predator laws threatens gangs like the Spanish Cobras, but new recruits seem ready to take up the spots emptied by death, imprisonment, or drift into low-wage work. These boys, they know their country does not know them, even if they spray their name in 10-foot letters on train stations. We all just N-words out here. One nervously touches his gun for reassurance, scanning the faces in a passing car waiting. Still strangers, they are products of the lead-poisoned soil of the American city. We ignore them at our peril. What strikes me is that this really feels a lot like an op-ed that I would read in, say, New York Times or Washington Post, and I kind of wonder if that's not where it was originally published, just on the basis of this is telling stories, but it's also sort of reporting on different groups of people. Probably it's in the Chicago Tribune, though, because I can see that it's really looking at Chicago. So my guess is that this is to make us think about a problem that might be existing. What do you think the purpose of this is?